Rarely do I get to talk to the same person on back-to-back episodes. Rarely do you even want that to happen. You usually have enough of that person the first time we go through it, but in this instance, last week's show, we had so many comments, we had so much feedback, and so many people were not only shocked at the views the person held because they just never knew before, but they thought the conversation was so incredibly interesting. And on my Patreon, I try to, anytime I ask for questions, hey guys, you have any questions for my upcoming guest? I try to make it a point to answer, or at least ask every single question. And this time there were too many, and they were too interesting, so the show was too long. We didn't get to all the questions. So my guest was gracious enough to come back a second week in a row to make sure we got to the rest of these Patreon questions. If you didn't hear last week's podcast, go listen to it. This one will make a lot more sense. It's I don't know the episode number. I've lost count over 13 years. But it's called Christian Host. This is Christian Host Returns. And that's what we're getting into today. How can a guy moderate debates on religion, on the Bible, on the existence of God, on Islam, and have access to all of this knowledge, see everything that we all see, and maintain his faith? That's really the interest point for all of this. How is he still a Christian? That's how it started. I emailed him, asked him to come on. I've been on his show several times. It's called Modern Day Debate. Everybody should go check that out on YouTube. Go listen to the podcasts. It's very, very interesting to hear the different sides of the debates. But he is the moderator. He always stays neutral. What does he really think? And is he actually holding on to his faith? Well, we had the whole show last week, and we ended that show in such a peculiar way. We ended up going into the Patreon extended version and had a long conversation, longer than we anticipated. So if you're not signed up, if you didn't hear the rest of that conversation, some of this might not make sense to you. But we ended it right when we got to women in the Bible. And there was this one moment at the end of that Patreon portion where I said, basically I was pushing him to say, either the Bible is not about equality, or how come women don't have the same opportunities as men in the Bible? And I said, look, if the Bible said people with dark skin cannot lead the church, would you be okay with that? And he said, yes. How do you like them apples? And my jaw dropped. I could tell the comments went crazy after the podcast. And then he had to abruptly end the show because we were recording, and I think he was recording in like a public library on the road somewhere. And he never got a chance to really fully explain himself. So even though you didn't hear that Patreon portion, that's how we're starting this show off. Because when I heard him say that, I got a little sarcastically skeptical.
Sarcastically skeptical. See, Smalley.
Smalley.
Sarcastically skeptical.
Sarcastically see Smalley. Skeptical.
Thank you so much for joining me today. For those interested, that song is by a band called Chasing Desolation. The actual song is called Back from the Grave. A lot of the song doesn't sound like that. It's a much faster, like heavier song. And then there's a breakdown in the bridge. And I just fell in love with that groove, reached out to them, said I would love to use that for the podcast. They loved it. They come to my comedy shows. I love them to death. Please go support and follow Chasing Desolation band on TikTok. They are phenomenal. So, that's where that song comes from. Join me in welcoming back to the show my guest today, host and founder of Modern Day Debate, James Kunz. James, thank you so much for being here, man.
It's all my pleasure, David. Glad to be back. Thank you very much for hosting me once again.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. How are you feeling about coming on here? Are you good with this? Because you don't normally express your views publicly about this kind of stuff.
Yes, that's true. It's something that, for me, being you could say, defending a conservative type of theology that we got into at the end last week, especially, is my nervousness is that I worry sometimes that people might say, "Oh, James, he has these controversial views. I don't like him." I'm relieved that you said that you already released the first episode, because I didn't notice like modern day debate have any sort of like loss of subscribers, because I thought people might say, "Oh, James, I didn't know he was like this. I'm out of here." But
Yeah.
that's one thing I have to say I'm grateful for, despite my worries about my being open about my views, is that I've actually found that the atheist community, the Muslim community, everybody at Modern Day Debate has actually been very cool about it. In other words, I think a lot of people at Modern Day Debate, most of our viewers, I would guess, are atheists, and they know I'm a Christian, and they're supportive. Like they're just like, "Hey, like, you want the same thing as me, which is a fair and neutral platform." I think that's a cool thing. So I'm grateful for that. But I am nonetheless, because I know that my views are, like I said, when I'm willing to dig my heels in and say, "How do you like them apples?" I know that for a lot of people, that might be too much. They say, I'm out of here, no more James." But like I said, I've been grateful that people have been very supportive of Modern Day Debate, whether they be atheist, Muslim, Christian.
So this is an interesting way to start this conversation, because I think this points to a huge difference between atheists and Christians. And I, this may be a little shot across the bow already, but Christians do really seem to care how other people think and believe. They feel compelled to um, win souls, right? They feel responsible for your soul. They feel like they have to talk to you. There are thought crimes in Christianity. If you think this, if you have this feeling, if you're attracted to this person, it really matters to Christians how you think, how you feel, what your thoughts are is super important. And to most secular people, we don't really care what your thoughts are. We care about your behaviors, right? So think how you want to think, believe how you want to believe. If you don't believe in abortion care for women, don't get one. But if other people do want that care, don't try to stop them from expressing themselves. And you don't want to dance, don't dance. But don't try to outlaw dancing because you think it's an affront to Jesus Christ or to God. Don't try to control other people. And I find it, it's hard to talk about religion without getting into politics and vice versa, especially in this country. But it seems that like the party of small government, I want the government out of my life, really wants the government out of Christians' lives, but they have no problem kind of pushing their agenda onto other people and saying, I want to legislate my morality onto you. And so when we come across someone like you, sorry, I'm trying to silence this damn thing. When we come across someone like you who is basically incognito, I mean, we just didn't know, that you held these views for many years, it seems. People are shocked to find out you have the view. It's only going to make them like you more. They're not like, "Oh, he has thoughts that I disagree with, so screw that guy." Zero people are going to cancel over that. In fact, they're impressed that you had your views, and your views are your personal views, which is what your faith or your worldview or your religion really should be. It should be a personal thing. And so when we stumble across someone who has the view but doesn't try to push it on other people, we're actually really impressed with that. So I think people are, while they disagree with you clearly, they really respect you for not using the platform that you've built to only push one side of the argument. The fact that the majority of your viewers are non-believers and had no idea you were a Christian until you came on this podcast, it says a lot about your character, I think.
Yeah, at the channel, at least, I definitely try to not evangelize. I think if Christians are consistent, they ought to. I think what was it, Penn? What was the name of the magician? He's an atheist. I think it was Penn and is it Penn and Teller?
Yep.
I should know this.
Oh yeah.
But one of them had said that, like, if you believe in this gospel idea of yours, then I would think you might hate me if you didn't try to warn me. And I think that's true. I think that I don't think you necessarily hate. I think there's a uh, other complex stuff, like maybe people are just afraid of rejection or afraid of, but nonetheless, so
Well,
I
trying to
do.
warn,
I'm
let
very
me just clarify,
for.
trying to warn someone is far different from trying to legislate behaviors based off your religion, right?
I see what you're saying.
So
Yeah, the
just the other day,
legislating.
Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on my door. I have no problem them door knocking and trying to save my soul. In fact, I invite them in to do podcasts and they just won't do it. But I don't mind the door knock and the I would like you to come to my side. That to me, in fact, I think there's some kind of federal requirement to keep your 501c3 religious status. You have to continue to try to get more members. So I don't have a problem with that at all. But knocking on my door and saying come to my church is nowhere near the same as I want to infiltrate the Supreme Court and control and take rights away from people that they've had for half a century. So.
I see what you're saying. The legislation, yeah, certainly there's a significant conceptual difference. I don't want to go too far on this topic because I know we have so many questions, so I don't want to.
Right.
But I appreciate that your kind sentiment and your support. I appreciate everybody's support. It's meant a lot.
Awesome. Let's dive in. Before we get to that, unfortunately, I think we have to. I feel obligated to give you an opportunity to further explain what you said at the end of the Patreon. Now, I guess I should have prepared the clip and played it for people, but I pretty much summed it up, and I think I did so accurately in the opening of the show. And let me just back up and say, a lot of times I like to do thought experiments. I like to find out. I want to be completely transparent with my tactics here. I don't really feel like this is a debate. It's more of a friendly discussion. And of course we disagree. So let's just have that open talk. But what I do as a comedian is bring two things together that are both true, but people don't ever think about, right? So occasionally I like to apply that same thing to my religious discussions and say, how do you reconcile A with B? You say both are true, but these are kind of exclusive or mutually exclusive properties. And how I do it in comedy is I'll say, when Christians get braces for their kids, are they finally admitting that God made a mistake? Right? It's a funny idea, a funny concept to go, you say God is perfect, yet you're having to take corrective actions on your child's face. If God loves your kid, why is his teeth so jacked up? What do you say to him? I'm sorry, God loves you. He just got a little busy the day he made your face. And then around that point, people start groaning. Oh, and I'm like, leave that. I'm like, that kid's racist anyway. Who cares about that kid? And I play around with this idea on stage. But those are still two things that I think are important to think about. Like, I think God is perfect. God watches over me. You'll say things in church like God watches over me all the time. You'll sing Psalms, I believe 121:7. He will keep us from all harm. It's just this overall idea of God loving me and then you get cancer, you have car accidents, you have all this terrible thing. You cut your arm open, you go to your kid breaks an elbow. You don't ever go, oh, God's not keeping me from all harm. You just kind of compartmentalize these things. And so in these discussions, I try to bring those two together without insulting the person. And so what I was doing at the end of that Patreon segment was I was saying that basically you're going, yeah, women are not allowed to have a higher position in the church, or not allowed to lead on positions of authority because they are women. And my thought on that is it seems incredibly limiting and misogynist to say only men can be the boss, women have a different role, but that different role is always lesser. It's clearly women should submit to men submit to God. It's never men submit to your wives, or men, you're not allowed to speak, you should ask your wives if you have a question. And it seems demeaning to women. It's very demeaning to women. And so you were defending it, which people have done for years on this podcast. But then when I've never compared it to race before, but because that's so prominent right now, I said to you, basically what I'm trying to do is, at what point will James break from the Bible and go, you know what, I'm not okay with that. Like, how far could this book go? If they found an original text that was in the Bible and it said something extreme, would he still support it? How far would he go down this rabbit hole before he himself goes, that's a little crazy, I'm backing off of that with my own morals, my own stance? So I pushed that with, if the Bible had said, if you have dark skin, you can never lead the church, would you be okay with that? Or would you challenge and, push back on the Bible? And you said, I'd be absolutely okay with it. How do you like them apples? So I want to give you a moment to explain that, because that truly was, I think, the most shocking thing that happened in the podcast.
Yes, I am happy to explain. I think, though I already kind of explained the same answer regarding sex. So the same answer that I would give regarding sex, namely the sexes in leadership, was I said, I don't think that it determines the value of a human being, like their value as a human, what role they have in society. I don't think that that is indicative of their worth as a person.
Okay.
And whether or not we see those as higher on the hierarchy or not. So I think that their value as people doesn't come from their roles in churches or whatever it might be. And I think the follow-up you had as well, but it's inherent. And if you are, told that you'll be doing this position, it must mean that God is, it must be that men are better at that, which I also didn't grant. I said that I don't think that actually follows, especially in light of, we could get into it. At the start of that conversation, we talked about God's omnipotence. So if God is omnipotent, he wouldn't necessarily have to have the most skilled people in those correct roles for you could say their gifts or skills, their competencies wouldn't necessarily have to match with the role that they're assigned, especially if he's omnipotent. Like you had said, it's kind of like the door swings both ways. In that conversation early, you had said like, hey, if there's a car going toward a stroller, maybe that person pushes the stroller out of the way so it doesn't get hit by the car. And that's your explanation for the problem of evil, is maybe it's a way in which that person was able to fulfill a godly duty or something. You said, but couldn't that person fulfill a godly duty without that being the case? And so in this case, if we were thinking about people in different roles, if God is omnipotent, the door swings both ways, such that you might say, well, God doesn't actually, because he's omnipotent, he doesn't have to have the most skilled people in the most skilled, or I should say, in the roles that would best match those skills. In other words, it could be that women are better at leaders. And I can tell you from being familiar with the leadership research, because it's part of my doctorate, is industrial organizational psychology. We study things like leadership, that there is good evidence that women may actually be, on average, better leaders than men. And that empirical fact, I don't think, is inconsistent with the scripture, if it nonetheless means that men and women are assigned different roles. But regarding the race,
well, hold on. Can I address that first before we move on to the race?
If you'd like to, I would like to answer the question you asked, though.
Is it fairly short? Because I don't want to forget what I'm going to say about this piece.
Sure, go ahead.
It just seems that it's really bad management to put someone in an exclusive leadership category if they are empirically not the best leaders. I get your explanation that if God is omnipotent, he wouldn't need the best leaders. But that begs the question, why have a leader at all if God is omnipotent? Why ever even anoint one sex or race or group of people as leaders at all? It kind of, and I don't want to offend you when I say this, but it feels like an intellectual cop-out to say, well, if God's perfect, he doesn't need to put the best people in the best roles, because he did take the time to say, these people are the leaders. And if you, like you said, and I was going to bring that up, I have a psychology background as well, not quite doctorate, but I definitely focused on that for 5.5 years in school. That idea that women are better leaders is pretty well known. It's pretty, the evidence is pretty significant. It just seems like kind of sidestepping the whole issue by going, well, God's perfect, so it doesn't matter. If it doesn't matter, why did he anoint anyone as leaders at all?
But I don't understand, why is it, if I say this explanation of, well, God is omnipotent, so he doesn't, so in other words, it seemed like your original assertion was, it seems like bad management, James, that God would put people in different positions that their skills aren't best matched for. Like, So that was your original like assertion. And I was saying, well, I don't know if it is though, because if we think of God as like an artist rather than the engineer that cares about this efficiency and management, then it may be that because he's omnipotent, he can still get the job done just as well
He could get the job done without
having
leaders
it-
at all, is my point.
while doing it this way. Or yeah, I mean, maybe it could be. So you can ask, so that's a different question though. So if you want to ask, well, then why? It doesn't seem like you're actually refuting my point when you just bring up a new question, which is,
Oh, fair,
well, if
fair.
God's omnipotent, hold on, let me finish, please.
No, I just said fair.
Is that
I'm just agreeing.
okay? Hold on. Oh, okay. Is it seems like a new question which we can discuss, namely, like if God's omnipotent, why would he assign roles? A lot of these questions, I'm amazed. Last week you said at one point, you said a lot of Christians say, well, it might be this, and you said it seems like a cop-out because it was on the problem of evil, and you said a lot of times Christians say, well, it could be this, and it's like, well, a lot of these questions, like, James, why would God, if God's omnipotent, why would he have males and females assigned to leadership roles or not? Is like, well, how could I possibly tell you definitively? Like, I would be arrogant. And I feel like that's the thing, is a lot of times Christians are lambasted if they say, well, here's the answer and this is the truth. And, so if I were to say that with regards to my answers to the problem of evil, or in this case, like, why does God have men and women in leadership roles at all? It might be like, wow, he seems so overconfident, and how does he even know that? And I'm just doing what I think would be the intellectually like honest thing of saying, like, I can only speculate. I can't read God's mind in terms of why, even as he is omnipotent, he would have men and women assigned to leadership roles or not. And so even when I'm intellectually honest and I say, I don't know, then it's called a cop-out. So I'm either arrogant or it's a cop-out if I say, like, well, I can't be sure, but I can speculate to my best guess.
If you just said I don't know, I wouldn't say that's a cop out. That's a fair. I mean, people say I don't know on this show all the time. If you don't know, you say you don't know. I don't think that's a cop out. But bringing up,
I'm saying
bringing
that
up
if I speculate.
What's that?
So I'm saying, but if I speculate, if I try to give you an answer, if I'm humoring your question, and I say, well, it could be that, for example, the problem of evil we're talking about, it's like, well, maybe it's these counterfactuals that I brought up last week. And you said, well, it seems like Christians are always just kind of saying, like, well, maybe it's this. And
theodicies.
When I'm just giving you my best shot.
Sure,
even
sure.
Then I'm criticized for being that I can't give you a definitive answer.
That's a good point. I don't mean
read God's mind.
That's a good point. And I don't mean to criticize you for it, but when you bring up an answer, I have to say, well, that now begs further questions, or that wouldn't make sense as an answer because of this. So the reason to me, the logical answer is men wrote the Bible, and God didn't have anything to do with it. Men wanted control, and they were in power at the time, so they wrote the book assuring women wouldn't get out of line. Like, to me, that is much more realistic than an omnipotent alpha and omega, most powerful being in the universe creates men and women. Men are not as good of leaders as men, but he deems them to be the leaders just because he's omnipotent. It doesn't make sense. So saying that he could do it just because he's omnipotent, I don't mean to, again, I wasn't trying to insult you, but and I want you to throw out potential answers. I want you to give your best shot. But you have to understand too, James, when you give your best shot, it's literally my job to evaluate that statement and say whether that makes sense, let's move on, or I'm going to push back on that answer because of X, Y, and Z. And that's what I'm doing. If you say God doesn't need to put the best people in the best positions because he's omnipotent, it logically follows, then why have leaders at all? So it is kind of refuting not your original point, but it does say that your answer for that refutation didn't really, to me, meet satisfactory requirements for answering the question. It's up to the listeners to decide if that answer satisfies them or not. I can tell you why, when I was a believer, these types of answers would not satisfy me because I would be like, well, why would he make leaders at all if he doesn't need leaders? It makes so much more sense that men wrote this book. And I would think that's where my mind goes. I go to the most logical, to me, it's let me word this as a question. I understand you have your faith, but do you agree that it's more logical that men wrote the book and made men the boss than an omnipotent God inspiring the book and laying out guidance that the poorest leaders should be the leaders for some unknown, bizarre reason?
Well, we could talk about this new question as well, but as long as we're on the same page, that like you seem to bring up the objection originally, I often say, so it sounds like you're saying, like, it seems like I've given a sufficient answer when your original question is like, why would God have it where people, at least in some cases, they may be in a position where their competencies aren't best match for that position? And I said, well, like, I mean, like, in other words, it seems like it's like, well, if God's a good manager, he wants to get the ultimate goal of that organization, kind of accomplished. And so you're saying, if people aren't best matched for their position. And I said, well, one is in terms of him being omnipotent, like he could do it. He can still bring about that ultimate goal, even if people aren't.
Sure.
And it's not like you really refuted that. You just brought up a new question of, well, why would God, if he's omnipotent, even have leaders? Oh, you can get into that question. But it seems like you would acknowledge, though, that it does actually answer your original question. It's just that you're bringing up a second question. I don't know how that in any way undermines my answer.
Well,
the first question.
Like I said, I just think it falls short of satisfactory. That's all I'm pointing out. And to be fair, your answer of God is omnipotent so he can do anything could literally be your answer to anything I challenge you with. So the idea, I was talking with my mom one time about the flood, and I said, Mom, they only talked about land-dwelling animals, but I heard a debate between two geologists, and one said, if that amount of fresh water from the clouds, actual precipitation, had fallen into the oceans to the point that it rose higher than the levels of the tallest mountains, I said it would have diluted the salinity of our water to the point that most marine life would have died as well. And I said, but it never talks about having to save marine life. It only talks about land-dwelling animals. And this is very likely because the writers of this early story never even really thought about the difference between water that falls from the sky and water that exists in the ocean. And rather than thinking about salinity and chemistry and logically going through that, my mother literally said to me, David, God could make a whale live in a tree. And I'm like, okay, no more questions, Your Honor. Like, there's no point in continuing that conversation, because if the point is God is magic, that could literally be the answer to anything. And I don't think that really satisfies most people's concerns about these inquiries into some of the illogical things that happen in the Bible. If that's the end result, okay, we just move on. And I do want you to answer the race challenge as well. But let's consider for a moment that God is so powerful, anything could happen, could literally be an answer to almost anything I ever ask.
But it was the answer you gave last week when we were talking about the problem of evil. It was you that was bringing up, well, God is omnipotent. That was your refutation that you kept bringing up. And so I just seems strange to me that it's okay for you to bring that up in order to kind of keep pressing your argument forward. But if I bring it up to say, well, it wouldn't need to be that you have to have these people in these right positions all the time. It seems strange to me. By the way, I don't think it's true at all that you can reasonably use God's omnipotence as an answer. One thing being like the alleged problem of an eternal hell. Like, I don't see how I could bring up God's omnipotence to give you a solution to that challenge from the skeptics. But in terms of the race issue, the reason that I said, how do you like them apples, wasn't as much of it was more because I thought, well, I mean, the answer is, if I were to say, oh, no, it wouldn't be okay with race, David. First, I think it might be counter to scripture, because God certainly seemed to have like a special purpose for the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. But the second thing is, it would obviously be inconsistent, because it would be like, oh, why are you okay if God does, kind of discriminates based on sex, but not race? So I would look like this kind of inconsistent person. And the reason though that I felt comfortable saying it was because like I gave those initial reasons, namely that a person's worth isn't based on their position in human hierarchies, which I hope you agree with. I know you do. And also that it also wouldn't even mean that it's their competence. There seems to be a scriptural idea here that, well, I'll give you that to keep it short.
Okay. Thank you for that. So, and I kind of figured that was your answer. It's the same. You don't separate people's value based on the role that they're given by God. And I'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to touch on something you said right before you switched into the race thing. You said it's okay for me to bring up God's omnipotence, but when you do it, it's a cop out. In my defense, when I'm talking about God's omnipotence, I'm speaking in a matter of it logically follows that X would happen, meaning God is all powerful. God loves us. When bad things happen, you would think that powerful being would logically protect or save us from these catastrophic issues. That logically follows. It does not logically follow that God is omnipotent, all knowledge in the world, all powerful in the world, in the universe, and would pick people that aren't quite qualified for the job to lead people who are actually better leaders than the leaders he chose. That doesn't logically follow. So sure, possible as a sort of who knows if this could be the answer, but in my situation, I firmly hold that it makes logical sense that an omnipotent being would do these things that make more logical sense. But I understand your race argument as well. I get it. You don't see it as that different, and I guess we just disagree there. I don't say that a cashier has less value as a human than the CEO of the company, but they do have different value within the company. The cashier is easier to replace. The cashier has a lower salary. The CEO is more responsible for more things. So anytime someone sets up an organization, if they, no company could work that way. No company could work that way, where we take the people who aren't the best leaders, we put them at the top, and then the people who are the best leaders, we tell them to submit to the terrible leaders. That doesn't make logical sense. And also to even assume that leadership is always based on gender or genitalia at all. It's just a bizarre thing that I think God did. And that's why I bring it up in these conversations. I just, to me, again, this is clearly man making a silly rule that men are always the boss or men are always in charge and women can only have authority over other women or children, and that women are not allowed to teach men. I mean, goodness gracious, what company or levels of science or areas of our world are ever made better by not allowing any person, to teach? If you have information to impart, you should be able to impart such information. But to say, no, you were born with a vagina, so you are never to impart knowledge to someone with a penis, is so bizarre to me. And it does not seem like there's any logical reason why a powerful deity would do that, let alone do it by skin color or whatever. So I'll let you have the final say on that before we move on to the next Patreon question.
I see where you're coming from without going too deep into it, so that way we can go to the next question. Just two quick things. One is, if I ever look like I'm looking down, I'm not wearing a watch. I'm not looking at a watch. I just have a scratch on my arm that just recently opened up. So anyway, the other thing is the problem of evil. That's something that last week, so you had mentioned, I think, that the problem of evil is, kind of what I'm saying logically follows when I bring up God's omnipotence. And I actually have a response from last week, but I'm not going to go into it. I want to at least just put it out there that I told you last week there was a point at which, when we got to talking about counterfactuals, I said it, from at this point, like I just kind of can't remember. I don't know where the next step is in my response. Right. I do have it, and it is a way that I would press and say that I don't think it's like logically follows the classic problem of evil that you mentioned. as being kind of this logical flow that you bring God's omnipotence into. But that's probably because we've covered that for like a long time. I'm okay with letting that go. I do just, if you ever want to hear it, I'm happy to share it. But I know there are
we
other
might,
Patreons.
thank you for letting me know you have that. We might get into that at some point. The problem of evil to me is I think the number 2 most difficult issue for Christianity to deal with. I think it probably has more deconversions out of Christianity than any other issue. I think it's the number 1 deconverter and the number 2 most difficult problem for apologists to deal with. And so it comes up all the time. It comes up in various forms. So I'm sure we'll address it. And when we do, we can go back and go line by line and actually start that conversation over. And I'm sure this will not be your last time on this podcast. I absolutely love these conversations, and you're fantastic at it. So yeah, I'm interested in that argument, and I'm sure we'll get into it soon. For the next question is from Jacob, and I believe Jacob is the one that suggested you for the show. So I'm going to read Jacob's question now. He said, my favorite part of listening specifically to the religious debates on Modern Day Debate, because you do more than just the religious debates, is going on YouTube afterwards and hearing the comment or reading the comments about the debate. The overwhelming consensus is usually that the non-believer won the debate. Considering this and assuming James reads some of the comments, I'd like to know from James how that makes him feel, knowing that the believers seem to always lose, and if he ever questions his faith seeing the responses, or maybe he thinks the Christians have the best reasoning and disagrees with the comments.
Yeah, thanks for suggesting me, Jacob, as a person to come on, by the way. And in terms of seeing the comments, I think that there are sociological factors that explain these. The biggest one being, although I would, obviously Christians lose debates, including on Modern Day Debate. Like I'm not, reluctant to admit that. But in terms of sociological factors, I think most viewers, so if you do look at the comments, yeah, it is true that most are definitely that way, as Jacob describes. I think most viewers of Modern Day Debate are atheists. And I think that there's an interesting phenomenon that I don't think atheists are any more guilty of than any other party. I think every party is susceptible to things like, so in other words, let me just first answer. First, many of those comments are there because the Christians did lose. The second one is, even in cases where I think that the Christian has won, in other words, by that I just mean they gave a more persuasive case, I think that let me give you an example of something that might give you like some good kind of anecdotal, at least, evidence that, but nonetheless, at least starting with empirical evidence, we know everybody has confirmation bias. You're more likely to pay attention to ideas or arguments, whatever it is, that confirm what you already take the position of, such as that Christianity is immoral or whatever it might be. And also, you're more likely to remember those things thanks to confirmation bias. There are other types of biases, but I think that this anecdote that I want to share it was just almost shocking to me. I started doing shorts on our YouTube channel recently. And some of them, I gave our audience a warning. I said, some of these are going to it's going to pretty clearly look like one side won. It's going to look like someone dunked on somebody else. We at Modern Day Debate are not trying to take a stance. We're just putting it out there as a sample to draw new people. We're not trying to push an idea. And I found that there were some where I would share a short that literally I asked permission of a Muslim content creator. I said, can I use your shorts from Modern Day Debate? And he said, yeah, sure. And so I used some of these shorts, and it was like pretty, there was one where it was like, this looks pretty clearly like I'm biased in favor of the Muslim fellow because he gets to speak the most. He has the last word and kind of does correct somebody on an issue, or kind of has a little gotcha. And I thought, man, people are going to think I'm biased. They're not going to like this. But I was amazed and maybe even relieved that even then, many of the comments were like, oh my gosh, this Muslim, like this atheist bodied him, or whatever, the slang that they use nowadays is, I was relieved that like the comments were also, and I was like, even when I took the short from the Muslim's page, so the Muslim had it on, do you think the Muslim would purposely put up a short on his own channel? He must be pretty confident that he looked good in that short.
Right.
And I took that exact same short and put it on our channel. And I thought, oh, they're going to think I'm biased in favor of Muslims. And nonetheless, there were many comments that were like, oh man, the atheist just taught him a good lesson. And
So
it just makes me think not that atheists are worse than anybody. I just think that every group tends to think that their person, generally, they tend to think that their person won most debates. Like, do you really like, yeah. So anyway, like think about it, Trump and Biden. I think there are a lot of like people that were pro-Trump or pro-Biden that were like, oh yeah, you know, Trump won that debate, I'm a Biden guy. Or I just think that, and obviously the response from every group is, oh yeah, of course, because my person really did win. And it's like, well, like maybe, but I don't think they win every time.
Right. Do you ever consider how, as a believer, if the majority of your platform is non-believers and the majority of the comments are reaffirming that the non-believer won, do you ever stop and think like, maybe I'm doing an injustice to my faith, or I'm doing an injustice to Christianity by serving what is essentially becoming an anti-Christianity platform?
Let's see. It is true that many of the people they hold to the position that Christianity is false. Many of our subscribers, like most of them. I don't feel bothered by putting out these debates. I mean, I think that one thing is we should all be aware of is if you have, and I'm not saying that all Christians I'm not saying all the Christians that we have on are, you know, bad debaters or poorly educated or anything like that.
Yeah.
Some of them are super educated and
over educated.
Yeah, that happens.
It does.
And so the idea is, if you see, well, let me put it this way. You probably, okay. You remember the movie Space Jam? Like, if you have the best of each side, like if Earth is going to send their best basketball players against the aliens sending their best basketball players, that's the most meaningful outcome. But if you were going to send like Earth's mediocre basketball players, like average basketball players, against Mars's average basketball players, that doesn't really say much about who's got the best basketball team, Earth or Mars, right? So in other words, I pay closer attention to the debates that have like the best debaters of each side. I weight those more heavily, but again, these are all also just if you think about it, modern day debate is a tiny piece of the puzzle of all the debates that go on about religion and atheism, including like peer-reviewed literature that, I mean, obviously is important too. So among other debate channels and podcasts, etc. So in short, I think that I think I drifted off what the original question was asking.
That's all right. Let's see. The second question from Jacob: as a moderator, one obviously has to stay impartial. I'd like to know if he ever wishes he could chime in or help some Christians out when a Christian is cornered by an opponent, whether it be a Muslim or whatever. Do you ever, and could you give a specific example, maybe without, getting into too much trouble, where a time where you really wanted to chime in and didn't, or have you?
Yeah. So I don't think I've ever, I probably have at some point and I just don't remember. So, but I'm trying to think of, I know that the times that I feel like especially compelled are times when something is stated that's like empirically wrong. And my confirmation bias probably leads me to detect that more often among people that don't share my view, right? So I try to not bring it up, even though that's the hardest. Something that, let's say, psychologists or sociologists have done the research and they're like, well, we tend to find this. And that's where I'm really, so it's actually not the philosophical arguments for God's existence or against as much as there's sometimes these like smaller, more concrete empirical claims where I'm like, that just, oh gosh, stop. But I still don't say anything in those cases that I'm thinking of, because the other debater hopefully will.
Yeah, I moderated a debate one time and this was live on stage in front of a bunch of people at a conference, between an atheist and a Christian, and there were so many times when I wanted to say something or chime in, and I just didn't. I just stayed, the referee. One time they were talking past each other, and I was like, the end of the day, this is educational, but it's also very entertaining for people. And as an entertainer myself, I realized that I'm watching the crowd and people are yawning and looking around and checking their phones. And I'm like, for the sake of the entertainment aspect alone, I want to take a shot at clearing this up to get them back on track. And so I spoke out of turn and said, I think this person's trying to say this person's trying to say this. Is that an accurate portrayal of each argument? They go, yeah, and then they come back on and start talking again. So regardless if I disagreed with the argument, I was like, I think you're misunderstanding what they're saying, or they're not saying it accurately or in a way you may understand. And that, I think, is our job as moderators, is to do that piece. So
I could do a better job at that. I'm still a work in progress.
Yeah,
I think you're right. In other words, is what I'm saying. I think that's
are.
important for the moderator to do, and I'm working on that.
So Eve says, he has two questions. Can you do your best steelman of both positions? And does he still love his Subway tattoo? What? You have a Subway tattoo?
I do, yes. And so Steelmanning, I'll start with from the front.
Okay.
Steelmanning, I think would they mean an atheist or skeptic position? Like
both. They want to hear your best steelman of both positions.
Both meaning like atheism and Christianity?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I see. I would say that atheism, really, the problem of evil doesn't get you a lack of belief. It actually would get you, of course, if you grant that the argument's sound, namely that the premises are true and that the conclusion follows from the premises, well, then you get that there is no God, not just a lack of belief, because there's obviously a conceptual difference between declaring or taking the position there is no God. And so I would say that the problem of evil is a very serious challenge to theists of all types. And in terms of, I'm trying to think of how to summarize atheism. I'll defer to atheists how they want to define it, if they just want it to be lack of belief or the position there is no God. If I was going to take an atheistic position that there is no God, obviously I'd use the problem of evil. I'm trying to think of other arguments for atheism. I would use a probabilistic type rather than the deductive. I think the deductive is
sure.
But the challenge I'd bring up against Christianity more so than what I hear on the debate channel is the Trinity. I think the Trinity, it's a very hard subject for Christians, and it is taken very seriously, so much more seriously among philosophers of religion. And by that, I mean like atheists as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's strange that it hardly ever comes up. Muslims will sometimes bring it up against Christians, but atheists don't, even though it is, conceptually Christians have to give an answer for the Trinity to the atheist, just like they do for the Muslim, or at least try their best, because it's hard to think of a good answer. So the Christian position would, of course, be that there's a personal God that would be, the three omnis. So, and then also, I would make the case that Christianity has a stronger case than other religions, which I also always find interesting, by the way. It's so interesting to hear for example, I think Richard Carrier once said, so he's a popular atheist debater. He said once that he said Islamic apologetics are like 400 years or 600 years behind Christian apologetics. It's so candid, because I don't buy it very much if atheists say like there's no more evidence for religion X than any others. I'm like, well, what are the odds that they'd all have the exact same amount of evidence? Now you could say, well, they all have zero. And I'm like, well, I wouldn't give a zero credence, a zero probability to like anything except maybe a squared circle, like contradictions.
Oh, shoot.
So in other words, I think even by random chance, anyway, I'm going off topic.
You are. I was just about to chime in and redirect, because I wanted to say something about you made a great point at the very beginning, which is that the problem of evil does not get us to know God existing. And I have said that for years, but Anytime I'm in a debate about the existence of God, I always bring it up. Now, why is that? Why is that the main argument? Because it's a two-step process. It's when I bring up the problem of evil, I'm not trying to get you to think there is no God. I'm trying to get you to realize that the God of the Bible is not worthy of worship. Okay? If he's not worthy of worship, even if he does exist, now that turns this on its head to say, if he's not worthy of worship, is he the bad guy? If he's the bad guy, why would you follow it? What if he's the bad guy trying to tell you he's the good guy, like certain politicians? Clearly doing clearly wrong things in public, right in front of your face, while looking you in the eye saying, I'm perfect, and if you don't see it, you're the problem. Is he gaslighting? Is it this crazy just denial of reality? What's he doing? And if he's the bad guy, who wrote this stuff? I want the believer to start thinking outside the box of God is good all the time, God is everything. So I bring up the problem of evil to say maybe God does exist, but maybe he hates us. Maybe he's not all that powerful. Maybe he isn't as powerful as he claims to be in the book. I want to get the believer to start to just put a little crack or to develop a tad bit of skepticism in their current belief. And I think just being like, there is no God is such an arrogant response to someone's faith. I think it's much easier to go step by step by saying, maybe here are some issues. Would you have done it differently? And they go, oh yeah, I would have never done that to people. Would you have condoned slavery? Oh, I would have never done that. Would you have said men are always the boss? No, I would have never done that. Why? Why have a moral stance on this? And then my response would be, it seems that you have a higher morality than the God you worship. And I would rather you have written the book. I would rather you have inspired these people. I would rather spend eternity with that person in heaven than the God who did all these terrible things. Just to make them start thinking through, oh, maybe 3 steps later, maybe a bunch of men wrote this stuff and I shouldn't take it so seriously. Maybe they were trying to maintain power and control over people and they were trying to figure out, meteorology before the science existed and science to study it, to be clear. Realize it rained before we had meteorology, just for the emails. So that's really the point. It's a process stepping toward perhaps somebody else wrote this, which could eventually lead to, okay, I guess there's not as much evidence for God as I once thought.
I hear what you're saying. I think that it's true that you could call that your own version of the problem of evil. I think it's different from the traditional, but
Sure.
I can see how it's similar.
Now, I need to know about this Subway tattoo. Why in the hell would anyone have a Subway tattoo? And is it Subway the restaurant, or do you just like really traveling underground in New York?
It is Subway the restaurant. So over the summer, I'm going to turn my brightness on my computer. I went. Okay, how long do you want to give me for a story? I can give you a story, and I want to know how long I can give it.
Well, we're almost an hour in already, and we're not halfway through the questions. So probably the shorter version of the Subway tattoo, I believe.
Okay, I got a Subway tattoo this summer. I'm going to show you, David. Okay.
Okay.
Your podcast has suddenly become rated PG-13.
Oh, and he's in great shape. Jesus, dude.
The Subway series tattoo is basically this summer a friend.
James, hold on. James. Okay, I'm putting this video on Patreon for sure. Now, and it's also probably going to go on OnlyFans, I think, because you're in amazing shape. I thought this was going to be a little logo of arrows or something. I thought this was going to be a bet you had, and you just had a little green and yellow. So that is massive across your back, dude.
Yes, it is. As a joke, it's for real. It is.
And it's very well done, too. It looks great.
You know what? Okay, have you ever seen the show Ink Masters?
Yes.
DJ Tamby is the only person that's won it more than once. He's won it 3 times. It was done by him. And the reason that's cool is not because, don't get me wrong, he's talented and he's super talented. But the coolest thing about DJ Tamby is that he's like the most humble, cool person. He's the kind of guy that would be like, hey, hey, there's a homeless person. Like, we should go help him out. Let's see if we can buy him lunch and stuff. Like, he's the
Cool.
coolest, most authentic dude ever. And he did the tattoo. It was for a Subway promotion where someone dropped a link in my Twitter group where we usually share like pranks or, you know, links to goofy things. And
Mhm.
I was like, I'm going to do this because Subway said in Las Vegas at DJ Tamby's tattoo shop, there will be one lucky fan that can get this Subway tattoo that's 12 by 12 inches and they get free Subway for life. And I said, that's my calling. I have to do this. So I flew out 2 nights early. I slept on the front step of the tattoo parlor, and then Subway honored it. They counted me as the first person in line.
Wow. And so you get free Subway for life? You walk into any Subway and everything's free?
I have gift cards they gave me. So it's a long sleeve. It's enough to last me for life. Yes. The gift cards that they gave me are
Wow. I thought maybe you had to rip your shirt off every time you went in for a sandwich to prove you were
not
the
quite.
guy.
No.
Do they ever ask to see it?
No, there was only one Subway I was recognized at, but that was like my own campus one because they were like, oh, I saw the Subway on, you know, New York Post because it was like media surprisingly covered it. And they said, they're like, it was, you know, some Fort Collins man that's getting his doctorate at CSU. He's like, I was like, we better keep an eye out for him. And so when I came in, he spotted me. But
wow. And you don't have any other tattoos, do you?
that was my first and only tattoo. So
That's
pretty
great.
crazy.
Like usually people that do stuff like that have, you know, stuff all over their bodies. They don't really care. Like, whatever, Subway. For that to be your first and only tattoo, that's a bold move, man.
It was really fun. It was
Wow.
it was probably my best adventure.
That's
So.
cool. I mean, it looks great. I mean, I was not expecting that.
Thank
I can't
you.
wait to watch back on this video and see my face when I saw the actual tattoo. I was like, what the hell? I thought you were going to roll up a sleeve and have a little arrow or something and we were going to have a chuckle about it. But man, that's what an awesome story. That's great.
I appreciate that.
All right, cool. So let's see. John says, is your belief based on, well, this is going to be the rest of the podcast. Oh, no. He says, is your belief based on something other than non-repeatable, untestable personal experience?
Non-repeatable, untestable personal experience. For my epistemology, I wouldn't require belief to be rational, or I wouldn't require those things for belief to be rational. So it is true that my personal experience of God is, you could say, like a piece. Like if it were missing, for example, like let's say I have these apologetics arguments, but then you say, James, do you ever feel like you experience God? And let's say I was like, no. You'd be like, that might be disconfirming though, potentially, James.
Right.
Doesn't it say he wants to reach out to you or, you know, have a relationship with you in the Bible? And so in other words, it is a piece of but it's frankly, in terms of my intellectual belief, my personal experience. That's, you could say, if they mean like repeatable, like testable in a lab, like if I pray and I feel like I experience God, like, is it at will in the same way then I would say, I don't know. Like I guess I've never done that test. But in terms of, you know, philosophical arguments like the problem of evil, I don't think of that as like a repeatable, testable, empirical type of thing. It's something that could be a good reason, though, to disbelieve in God, or likewise, I think that there are philosophical arguments that are good reasons to believe in God. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's my answer.
Okay. Fair enough. I want to say I'll do one more here, but I'm also going to reveal what I think is the number one most difficult thing for Christianity to deal with. I mentioned earlier that I think the problem of evil is number 2. I'm going to reveal what I believe number 1 is. And I'm going to pose that to you and have you respond to it at patreon.com/David C. Smalley and the extended version of this show. That's what we'll be getting into, but as well as more questions. Let's do one more of these questions. I will wrap it up with Bugmaster again. Bug says, David, I can't help myself. I'm a James groupie. One more question. James, in all these debates on religious topics, have you ever heard a truly interesting and novel argument from the other side? If so, what was it?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's certainly interesting arguments from the other side. In terms of new arguments, yeah, I mean it's fun. I like novel arguments. They are, in a way more pleasurable, but I think that there's a reason that the same arguments are generally brought up by each side, not always, but oftentimes because they've just been kind of tried and tested. Like been shown to be pretty persuasive.
Right. I'll say that the reason I bring up a lot of the same arguments over and over is because the answer tends to fail, the satisfactory test. And the comments, even from believers, I'll get emails from Christians saying, "Oh man, I thought he was going to get you with this. And when you asked him this, I was so disappointed. Now I have so much research to do. I don't know how I feel about that question." And then months later, they'll email and say, "I don't believe anymore." So I have had people multiple times say that a Christian, not properly being able to answer a question did sort of crack their faith a little bit. But it's the Christian doing it. It's not me. It's the fact that answer fell on its face. And so those types of arguments I continue to use, even though I'm like, again, on the entertainment aspect, I'm like, I don't want to do the same show over and over. But if this person's never heard this before, it might be really beneficial to their journey, so I kind of have to balance that. So there's probably a good reason, like you said, even for Christians too. Same arguments, same challenges to atheists back and forth. A lot of it's repeated.
Yeah, I wish I had something that came to mind more quickly. There's got to be something. So Jacob, feel free to email me at moderndaydebate@gmail.com. And if you want to ask me if I can think of it, I can try to follow up with you, because I do want to give that to you, because there are definitely interesting new things that I hear on the channel for sure. And I just sad that it's just drawing blank right now, but it's maybe just because it's the end of the day and I'm tired.
No worries. The YouTube channel, Modern Day Debate, the podcast, Modern Day Debate, a lot about religion, but sometimes not. Sometimes about, flat earth, sometimes about abortion. I mean, is there any topic off the table? Is there anything that you will not cover? Like if there was a white supremacist that wanted to come on and debate that white people are superior, would you allow that conversation to happen, or would you say there's some things we're not gonna address?
Yeah. So to quote Kant, in order to avoid thwarting our own purposes, we do follow the YouTube terms of service. However, that does allow us to still host some really controversial topics and people. And that's, I think, one of our main criticisms is that Modern Day Debate, we have hosted people that, frankly, from what I can tell, have been neo-Nazis. Mm-hmm. When we have, I've wanted to be careful about making sure that, for example, the two individuals I'm thinking about, there was a summer in 2020, we had this big debate, and Destiny and Vosh are very strong debaters who are certainly not Nazis, who I had purposely matched and teamed against these guys because I really believe, and I think the empirical research really does, like I would love to go into like a robust case for this, because I can quote a lot of like some of the research that's relevant, that when these people are exposed, that the research would suggest, even if, because sometimes people say, because I say, well, who did you think won that debate? Because Vosh and Destiny, very strong debaters. And I say, I think it's good that we had these neo-Nazis exposed. That's good. People are seeing the rebuttals to their stuff that they try to, you could say, indoctrinate people with. So it's the same thing as like religion, right? Like presumably atheists are like, yeah, debates are good because, we show that faith is baloney or whatever it might be. And I would say, well, okay, well, the same principle works for neo-Nazis. And they say, well, but it might be, though, that the neo-Nazis are winning because they still might win people over because they're, let's say, they have a good sense of humor, or they're charming, or even maybe good looking, whatever. And I'd say that's where I'd say the empirical research is really clear on this. It's called the elaboration likelihood model. It's by Petty and Cassiapo. It's 1985. So it's a theory, so mountains of evidence behind it, suggesting that logic and evidence wins out against these more peripheral things like the appearance, the attractiveness of the debater, or the sense of humor of the debater. And so I would say, even in those cases where you think like, well, they might win because they're more charming, is that the research says no, the person with the strongest arguments, which I presumably they'd agree with me, would be you could say, anti-Nazi position. that side, according to the scientific research, is winning those debates. In other words, more people are being persuaded in that direction. So we would host anything within YouTube terms of service for those reasons.
Okay. That's fair. And I've received similar criticism for the exact same thing. And the criticisms I understand. The criticisms are well provided and have strong basis. I understand. I get it. I've had people, twice now. I think I've had a white nationalist on because my idea for the platform was to intentionally expose bad ideas so that they can rot in front of everyone. I want people to see the terrible ideas. But then there's this word platforming. You're like, well, you're platforming, just like what CNN just did with Trump. Some could argue that the way he acted and what he did was very detrimental to him winning the presidency, but the way the audience was responding was very disturbing. But it got E. Jean Carroll apparently even more money now. She's filed a secondary lawsuit because the day after he defamed her, or after he was found liable for defaming her, I believe it was $2 million she was awarded for sexual abuse he was deemed liable for by a jury of his peers, and then $3 million on top of that for defamation of character, a total $5 million settlement or a suit or decision. The next day, CNN's platforming him live on television. I had mixed feelings about it. I'm going, sure, I want his bad ideas exposed and challenged, but he's going to mock her again. And she is now, if you trust in the majority of our justice system, he's a sexual abuser who was about to mock his victim on television in front of millions of people. And he did just that. And then she received tons of death threats and more harassment and bullying online to the point that she can't hardly do anything on social media. And now they're back in court again. And so I, on one hand, I don't think I would do it live. I think live would be much more difficult because when you have someone like that on live, if someone's a white supremacist or in some sort of neo-Nazi group or anything based in hate, it doesn't have to be Nazi related, but that just seems the most prominent right now, which is why we're talking about it. You just never know what they're going to say live. At least with a recorded podcast, I can, if they just randomly throw out someone's address or try to dox someone or whatever, I can edit that out. But I lean toward you on this, that where I would, I have them on. I want to expose the bad idea, and I want that person who clearly lives in a very tight bubble to stop and think about something in a way they've never thought about it before. And one of the most brilliant things I saw, I don't recall, it seems like I thought it was Oprah, but it wasn't Oprah. I mean, Oprah had the Klan on her show. Jerry Springer had the Klan on. I think Maury Povich had something with white supremacists on. Their views and the way they talk is the crowd's going, what are you doing? What are you talking about? It can kind of lower their status in society and make them be taken less seriously. But the best thing I ever saw, it was a similar thing. It was like a Wendy it was some sort of smaller sort of daytime television show. They had a guy on who wanted to start his own city of whites only. They were literally going to get this acreage of land, make it a city where only white people can move into the city. And he was trying to get more people to pitch in so that he could pay for it. So he was willing to go on national television and say, if you're a white who wants to live with whites only, you should pitch in at this website. And they allowed him to come on to promote it if he would be willing to take a DNA test. And he took the DNA test, and they briefly allow him to mention what the deal was. Yeah, this is the website, yada, yada. And then they were like, and you are, 3% African or whatever. And he was just like, no, there's no way you're lying. He accused them all of lying, said it was fake or whatever. But that I thought was really interesting that they kind of gave that option. Of course, his town never got off the ground and never actually went anywhere. But it was interesting seeing someone who believed in white purity be told, that he had African DNA. that to me, that educational piece, gosh, I'm kicking my camera. That educational piece, I think, could be very, very effective. So I was glad they did that, and I would love to do that on this show. So yeah, I agree with you completely about that. It's tough, and the criticisms are well warranted. But if we're here to expose bad ideas, it's the same reason why you continue to have atheists on modern day debate. You think the position is wrong, and I'm guessing that your position is, at least I have a group of non-believers who get to hear about the gospel on a regular basis, and eventually someone might buy it, right?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's actually very rare that the gospel's shared, but, and I'm not being, I don't hope that doesn't come off as pedantic. The only reason I say that is just that I also, it's for a different reason. I don't know how much people base their beliefs on these debates. Now, I do think in degrees. So that's the thing is, so sometimes people say, well, you think these debates change minds? And I say, yeah, I do. And like, oh, you mean like all the way? And I'm like, well, no, I think it comes in small degrees.
Always.
It's not like you like
It's a marathon.
flip from one debate.
Yeah, it's a marathon.
And then for some people, like I said, so it's like there are probably different pockets of people. So like for some people, like they're probably open-minded and they're willing to change. And then there are some people that they're working hard to like be as resistant to what they're hearing as possible. And so anyway, I think we're quite aligned on that.
Okay, very cool. So there are so many more questions from patrons, down to other questions about your faith, things about that you would change about it, kind of some of your thoughts and feelings on where you have lines to draw in the Bible, which I was trying to get at the end of the last show when I was talking about the race aspect of power and control within the church. They want to know, kind of your thoughts on, could there be something in the Bible where you would say, okay, clearly I'm out, I'm done with that. So I'm sure the problem of evil will come up there. You may get a chance to share the last part of that argument, which I'm looking forward to. And I'm going to reveal what I believe is the number one most difficult question for Christianity, even though it's not as often brought up in these debates. Much like you were like, I wish they would talk about the Trinity more, or atheists should probably challenge the Trinity more because it's very complicated and a lot of Christians can't answer it. There's another thing that I think is the number one problem for Christianity. And as a believer myself, this was the number one thing I struggled with. And I'm going to reveal that. We're going to get into it. And I want to know how you respond to that challenge. And that conversation continues right now at patreon.com/David C. Smalley. If you're not coming with us, please at least drive like you know each other.